Chapter 4.2, Part 2, Spiritual Beings and Ancestors. So we're going to look at a lot of artworks that reflect the belief in spirits and gods and ancestors. And this is predominantly from our textbook is saying this Native American and African culture. It's also very true of a lot of Asian cultures as well, Middle Eastern when you look further back. So in African cultures, we're going to look at this first, where the actual sculpture, the object, it has a spiritual presence. So many times when an artisan, a person who's making a sculpture, they're really praying and focusing a lot on the energy of a particular spirit when they're making the sculpture, so that particular sculpture is holding, if you will, that spiritual presence. Perhaps other sort of a shaman or another priest would be involved in blessing it as well. That I don't know. In this case, when we look at the Native American sand painting, then we'll see that stated. But we want to make sure we understand that the rituals and the enactment with the piece, the interaction with the piece is going to activate that spiritual presence, if that makes sense. So you can kind of see with this dry looking piece of wood, it's about 25 inches high, this part's a bit darker. It's very likely that people touched this area because the childbirth and to enact this ancient woman or ancient mother figure, to enact some of the rituals associated with her at that time, it's very likely she was actually handled as opposed to the way we think of like a deity or a sculpture compared to Christianity, something high up that we're not really touching, if that makes sense. So these are perhaps handled more in African culture, and this is for the Poro Society, and they're responsible for male initiation and maintaining religious practices. Our figure here does not look human, and that's important to note. Her breasts are extremely large to really connect her to motherhood. Her arms are quite large. Her face is distorted, but that is intentional from the Senufo culture to show that this is a goddess and not a human. So exaggerated breasts, ancestral spirit, and this is a guiding, again, for those religious and historical traditions to do with, men coming of age, male initiation, which usually means circumcision. Okay, so we're going to go on to the Navajo sand painting, and this is really important to note that these were temporary pieces, and a lot of time and energy goes into many days, and sometimes, more than that, that they're very meticulously created, and they're using, if you look here, these are their paint dishes, if you will. So that would be corn, and there would be different materials here, like rice and different colored materials, so that they would use those as different sand and grains of different colors from the earth, and they would put them into their painting very carefully by hand. There's not any brush. It's not a real painting in the sense that there's no brush happening and there's no liquid medium happening. It's just sort of dry powder put into different shapes. Tibetans also do this, which is kind of interesting to note, across the Bering Strait, which is possibly what our native people are all descended from, is from the Tibetans. It's a guess. They don't know for sure, but they also do a sand painting that is not too unlike this. So in the Navajo culture, these guys are focused. They're in a certain mental state in order to make this healing sand painting, and usually it's because of a problem that's arisen or a health issue or something that needs to be resolved with the gods and with the forces of nature. So they're trying to promote this harmony with health and well-being, and eventually a person, whoever is affected in the community, will sit in the middle of this and then sort of destroy it once it is finished. And a shaman would preside, or medicine man is going to preside over the ritual at that point. So lots of building up with the sand of materials such as corn and other kinds of minerals, and then a person who is ailing or out of alignment or harmony with the group, or perhaps they're hoping for different things to happen in the community. That person's put in the middle, and then a ritual proceeds to enact the healing forces, and it's wiped away. So it's temporary, and that person absorbs the power from the ancestors, if that makes sense. Whatever's depicted in the painting, that person's going to absorb that power. So many cases we see this thing where you're calling to earth heavenly beings, or you're bringing up from below, or you're trying to enact these spirits, calling on the ancestors or the spirits. So in some cases, connecting with the gods, there are people that are intermediaries. Now, we just talked about a shaman or a medicine man. That would be one. Oftentimes, it's also a ruler. So in some cases, like the Queen of England actually is a religious figure. We don't think of her that way, but she's connected. Supposedly that she is selected by God to rule England, and then also she's head of the church. We don't really think about that too often anymore, because we have in the U.S. a division of church and state. But many times, especially if you think about Egypt as an easier example to think of, the pharaohs were the embodiment of the gods at that time. So rulers are depicted interacting with the divine, and they have a divine right to rule. Okay, so our more current example is the Queen of England, very ancient line, and there were also some very ancient lines up until very recently in Africa, where people were still connected in that divine right to rule. In the 21st century, we see very little of that. 20th century, it began to fade away in particular. Okay, so this is another stela. The stela is a stone. This is a particular sandstone. It's a little bit softer than our picture, our image of Buddha that we had that was carved. This is a carved sandstone piece, which is quite a bit softer. And in this case, we have Naram Sin, and this is our figure here, who is the ruler, and he's our focal point because he is larger than the other figures. This is called hierarchical scale. We'll get into that later, but not only is he above the other figures, he's larger. So he's interacting with the sun deity, which is not depicted as God. It's just depicted as the sun itself. So we see this happening, and there's a call, the calling up to this sun, and he's hoping to ensure continued prosperity in his kingdom. Wants to keep a favorable connection with the gods. So he's commemorating a victory, and you see these sort of stela in Egyptian culture as well, very similar